I'm going to break today's conversation into three parts, really. I'm going to talk about um, my practice, how I got where I am going with my practice, a little bit about my practice and where that's unfolding. I'm going to talk a little bit about the projects that I've done around grief and art, and a couple of projects in particular, but also the foundations of the project model. So for anybody that's working in a space doing grief support, you can get a little bit of idea about the types of foundations that form up that model that work really well. And within that, a little bit about a couple of conferences. And I'm going to finish up with talking about a publication, my first foray into literary work around grief. And that's what I'm going to finish the day with on. Welcome. Like many people that work in the grief space, my practice and my artwork really started out of personal experience. And I have two significant adult life grief events which were quite close together, which really triggered my journey. And I want to acknowledge that grief, we often talk about it in terms of death and death literacy, but grief is really about loss of something. And so my first really big grief experience was loss of health. In 2006, I became really ill with what turned out to be chronic fatigue syndrome, and I lost my health completely, spent the better part of 12 months bedridden, and I still live with chronic fatigue today. And that's had significant impact on my life. It's had many, many benefits, but particularly in the early days, it took away huge amounts of my life. In fact, pretty much my whole life for a long time. And that was a really big grief event, was mourning my health, mourning the dreams that I had to let go of, the capacity that I had to function. So that was 2006. And a few years later, my second grandson was stillborn. He was overdue by a week and really shouldn't have been stillborn. And that was a huge grief for our whole family. My daughter, it was devastating for her and her husband. For me, as a grandmother, it was a double loss. I lost a grandchild, but my daughter was forever changed by that experience. And so even though she didn't die, it was a death in a way. And that was a huge grief and is still really prominent in our family today, despite the fact that we deal with it very openly and very lovingly and supportively. It's not something that's, will ever be put to bed and resolved. So we worked with that for a while, and in sort of the about 2013, when I was just really starting off a more serious art journey, I also had a realisation that I wasn't really actively dealing with my grief because I was trying to be supportive of my daughter. I was doing the grandma thing and trying to support the family. But my grief it wasn't awful every day, but it was stuck. At that point in time, a project arose in Tasmania called Paper Garments for the Grave, and I went, that's me. I rang Lynn, I put an application in and was one of 10 artists who was successful in that project, which was 10 artists making literally paper garments for the grave. And it was funded in order to initiate and encourage conversations around death and dying and grief and loss. And it was a profoundly successful project with ripples that went out from the project as a whole, but it was also profound for me. I'm going to share a screen. If it's a bit clunky, I apologise. So this is the garment that I made for the Paper Garments for the Grave project. It's called Christening Shroud, and it was made in honour of my grandson Cody and my daughter. And it was a traditional christening gown, but with modifications for burial clothing. And it was around the story that for a stillborn child, the christening and the funeral are one and the same. And it was such a powerful process to make that garment. I would spend weeks really busy with it, and then I would have to have a few weeks off because it was all getting a bit too much, and then I would back on it. But it really showed me how powerful art is as a process in terms of personal agency in the area like grief. And it still has today. This garment was made with lots of features of a traditional christening gown. So across the little bib area, it's all smocked. And one of the other artists on the project said to me, "Oh, you can't smock paper." And I said, "You just watch me." And I did. So, but it's got a lot of that traditional embellishment that signifies the christening and the christening gown, along with things like the long little sleeves, which would cover hands that might have skin damage from the death processes, and feet, and a little bonnet to cover up where there may have been any autopsy marks. So for that aesthetic as well. Inside the little coffin, there is an angel's wing made from hand-cut paper feathers that is never seen, but is actually part of that particular work. So it still gets annual outings, and that was at the Public Health Palliative Care International Conference in the Blue Mountains last year, and that was on Infant Loss and Memorial Day. And so I'd taken a whole lot of grieving and grief artwork up to that conference, and we had that piece up there on display. And on that day, people with the conference, were invited to bring a flower, either as a general remembrance, or if they had someone they knew or a stillborn that they wanted to memorialise or remember, they could provide a flower or, you know, another little object. By the end of the day, that little table was just full. It was a really beautiful moment. And for me, it's really beautiful that that garment is still as heartfelt and touches people, and the story touches people, and that it has value, you know, a number of years later, and will continue to do so. So that's what I made, and I realised during that process how potent it was. There's a number of things that garment does from an arts perspective. It certainly stimulates conversation, and it really touches people who've had that experience or know someone who's had that experience. Do you want the second photo back? Did everybody see it? No, I'll bring it back then. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yep. Okay. I might just leave it there because it's easier to hop in and out. Sorry about the mess around it. The garment's about memorialisation, common experience. It certainly gave me agency in grieving, and for many people, I've stood in galleries and watched people read the story and shed a tear and really connect with that, and been quite powerful, if sad for them. It's about memory, it's about connection, and it's about valuing the relationships we have with the people that we grieve for. But also the relationship we have with our own grief, and art allows us to do that. It's expressive, but it's about a whole lot of other values too. That led me to go on and do some other explorations around grieving, and I got really interested in the concept of mourning garments. That's called Mourning Helmet, and it was a piece I did for my studies, and it was about both the fragility and the strength in grieving, and using lots of old damaged bits of recycled material to really draw on you know, what that feels like as someone that's grieving. You're both very, very strong, and you're very, very fragile, and you can feel very, very damaged for a lot of the time until you start to get some agency and get some transformation happening. And it doesn't mean the grief goes away, but it just means that you find different values and different depths and different richnesses and different ways of management. And I'm often drawn to the term from the film Collateral Beauty. And I think that's a really powerful term that can be very much linked in with art and grief, and how they work together to really bring out that sort of collateral beauty and find the depths and the richness and the heartfelt aspects of the grieving process. Sorry, I'm just checking some notes to make sure I don't forget anything. So mourning garments became really interesting to me as vessels that had historical purpose and lots of value and hold lots of possibilities. So mourning garments historically are about a public acknowledgement that someone is grieving. it provides them with not a complete separation from community, but it marks it off as a special place for those things. And mourning garments can become oppressive if they're worn for too long or expected for too long, like in Victorian England, where women often wore them for years. But they do have a really powerful place to help us express grief, to help us acknowledge the importance of the grieving process, and to help with that memory and relationship, and throughout have agency through that process. So there was Mourning Helmet, and then I came to this piece, which is called When Words Are Not Enough. This piece is made from recycled used tea bags primarily, and it's a traditional Victorian mourning style garment is the inspiration, but in the back of the garment there's a little shrine that you can see, which has candles and flowers like you'd find on a shrine or in a grave, and a lot of words around grief down the bottom. And this piece also travels regularly to Dying to Know days and other sorts of events like that to help stimulate conversations around grief and loss, death and dying, and the importance of engaging with that process. Memorialisation is not just you know, putting it out for the public, but it's something that continues on, because relationships in grief continue on, and it helps us start to chart out, if we're grieving, how our relationships are going to grow and continue with the person that's no longer with us, because the person is not there physically, but the relationship continues. And art can help us find really powerful, expressive, heartfelt ways of doing that. I'm going to skip now through to the projects, and I'll come back to some of the artworks, because I understand that there's at least one person here who works in the space and has to leave halfway through, and will be quite interested in the project-based work. So if I get out of this share again, right, back, okay. So the projects, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of approach. I wrote a paper that I was supposed to deliver at a conference in July this year, the International Grief and Bereavement Conference in Melbourne. That was cancelled, along with many other things. But I wrote a paper, and I thought that I might just find my glasses and read out a couple of aspects from that paper, which was actually about presenting the model that I've developed to work with grief and art. So I'll find my glasses and just read out a couple of little paragraphs for you from the paper. The therapeutic foundations of the projects bring together a number of strategies that are recognised as having value in grief counselling, body-mind therapies and art therapy. At the root of the approach is the proposition that conscious motor activity and mental activity, conscious art-making activity, creativity that is focused on a subject, and a process that engages motor activity and mental activity, allows emotions and thoughts to arise spontaneously. Art making can be a bridge between the body and the mind. The generation of awareness through art making allows thoughts and emotional responses to be considered, engaged with in a very dynamic way. And that's where, you know, the idea about having agency in your grieving process and being able to sort of manage and control and direct that for your own benefit comes in. Art making processes have a resonance with body-centered and energy-based practices such as dance therapy. The dynamism of the process and actions mean that whatever arises in the process keeps moving and it keeps progressing. It doesn't become stuck. Creative activity is similar. It keeps you moving on to the next thing. So you're going on a journey rather than just being stuck with a particular aspect of a process. Making creative choices lets participants experience the power to choose and direct their experiences. Not only is there a focus on tactile engagement in this model, there is a particular focus on tactile experiences that have the capacity to evoke memory. So familiarity, connectedness, and bring comfort. So the feel of textures, the holding of known and treasured objects. They all have the capacity to connect people with the things that are really precious to us and heartfelt. And that happens within the project model. Experiences like this introduce grieving individuals to the possibility that pain of their grief is not absolute and is not separated from precious memories and connections. So engaging the senses bypasses the logic part of our understanding and the stories we might have generated that we can get stuck in. The sense of touch can move us back into our feelings if we start to intellectualise things too much in a connected way, and it grounds us in a larger context. I talk about a haptic approach. Haptics often used to talk about technological aspects of touch and visual stuff, but I'm talking about haptic in a really, really basic sense in terms of really basic technology, needle and thread. That's basic technology, but you're touching it, you're working with your hands, and it's a way of communicating. The kinesthetic process is part of that as well. And then finally, I use a narrative approach to art making that allows people to actively engage in their stories, in their telling their stories, in their retelling their stories, and also in their reframing the stories. Because when you make artwork, you make really active choices about what you want to remember, what you want to express, what you want to enhance. And that's really powerful from a therapeutic perspective, and particularly powerful when combined with creative approaches that are all integrated. So that was the little bit of reading. And now I will go on and have a look at a couple of particular projects that embody those aspects. So I hope that anybody who works in the space, what I've just read out explains what the approaches are so that you can sort of see how they work within the projects. So share again. So we had Mourning the Missing. I'm going to full screen that. Can everyone see that? Is that Lynn, is that up? Yep. Okay. Mourning the Missing was a project that I was happily very involved with Lynn in. She was fantastic support for the whole project from the beginning, the idea right through to the end and onwards. And it was a project in which we had 6 people who had people in their families that were missing, maybe never been found, but maybe been found years later. And a couple of people in that group were actually making as proxy makers for people that couldn't be there. But fundamentally what we did was we made mourning garments for the person missing in their lives to provide them with an opportunity to explore their grief, explore their relationship, and find a pathway through their grief, and maybe hopefully get some resolution from the process, because they've never been able to say properly goodbye to the person that was missing that they've loved. And also often when people go missing in tragic circumstances, the relationships that existed before weren't perfect. And when there's been difficult relationships, that can really compound and make grief quite difficult. So this picture is of the 5 garments that were made for the project, and they were exhibited during Missing Persons Week, and that was a really profound project for everybody concerned. And what was beautiful was not just the work that was produced, but the peer companionship, that empathetic, compassionate peer companionship that developed through that project. And that is, I guess, an important part of grief for arts and community arts, is that grieving people live in communities. So it's really important that they feel that they can have peer companionship and compassionate support within the communities that they live. Accessing professional support all the time isn't an option for most people. So these are ways of doing that. That group of work then was requested to be included in an art show, and got a really profound response to that. And now that there is an ebook about that project, and the link down the bottom is the where you can find the link to that particular ebook if you want to have a little bit more look at the project and some of the stories behind some of the garments as well. And this project, sorry about the blurry photo, I couldn't find a better one once I blew it up onto the PowerPoint. This project was Wrap Me in Memories, which was developed to bring people living with dementia in residential care facilities together with their families to make a memory quilt. And this is a memory quilt of a lady who had very advanced dementia. She wasn't really up to doing much sewing, but her daughter came in and guided the sewing process and brought lots of other family members in. And you can see there's things on that quilt that the mother had made before in different parts of her life before she had dementia. We've also got little clear pockets with flowers in. We made them clear because the lady concerned was a little bit of a kleptomaniac in the residential aged care facility, and by putting clear pockets on, everyone was able to track what she'd nicked and where it needed to go back to, so it had a practical purpose as well. In the dementia space, particularly with advanced dementia, is a really challenging grieving space. Families come in to visit people in residential care facilities. They feel fraught, they can't stay for very long, they might have kids with them that aren't particularly interested in being there, there can be guilt, it can be really quite a fraught space. The purpose of this project was to bring families together in a loving, connected, shared space, so they were not only maybe collecting memories before they got lost, but they were also making new loving memories and helping with that early grieving aspect that was happening, and giving lots and lots of comfort and joy to the person with dementia. This quilt was finished, and I haven't put the photo up because I don't have permission to do so, but I have a picture of it covering the lady that it was made for. She died about 3 weeks later. So this was a really, really timely project for that family and profoundly rich for them. So this is a, you know, not a professional artistic approach. It was just whatever was there. You can see we've got some photos on it that we printed off onto fabric, but a really powerful way to use art in sort of, you know, family settings, in mundane settings, to create something special and support the grieving process. And I'm just going to stop sharing again. Yay, back. So that was there. Yeah. While we're on projects, last year I was at a conference. Lynn and Lane were there. The Public Health Palliative Care Conference, International Care Conference in the Blue Mountains, and for the first time they'd introduced a really strong artistic element into that space. So as well as all the academic papers, there was a lot of artwork on show. There was lots of arts activities for people to get involved in, and it really changed the tone of the conference. It really brought out a lot of heart of conference. There was still the academic intellectual content, but it was a really special place to be. So that was sort of another way that the power of art sort of really came through strongly for that space. I'm going to return to my little share screen again and go back to artworks. Part of the Victorian mourning garment, that was a multi-layered garment. It was a story about grieving. So the picture that you saw before was about that external layer that everybody sees. Then underneath there were these other two layers. The bottom layer that you can see peeking out was very, very colourful garden collage, petticoat and corset. And that was about the love and that exists underneath the grief. That, you know, intense grief is associated with intense feelings and lots of connection, and so grief to some extent equals love. The other aspect of it was this newspaper obituary page petticoat chemise that I made that went with it, and that really was about that memorialisation process. And I've reflected since that the way we see grieving done around us, the way we manage grieving ourselves, and I've heard it said by palliative care nurses, impacts on the way we approach death and the way that we die. Because grieving is for the people that have been left behind, but if you're approaching death, understanding that there will be memory, there will be grief, there will be legacy, is about feeling loved and not approaching death alone as well. And that's an aspect, I think, that's really interesting to explore in the grieving and grieving art space, although I haven't really got there yet, but I've made a note of it because there could be a new body of work coming out of that. The obituary page garment here is all woven at the top, which was quite a fragile thing to do, but I got there, and really made me think about the use of obituary pages in art and for artwork and for that memorialisation process. And so that led to a series of works, oh, not that one, made out of obituary pages. And some of these featured in my last exhibition. So these pieces are called In Memoriam and Return. And this is, the long one is about 4 metres long, all woven out of sliced up obituary pages with a copper and paper thread through it. And it's so large because it's talking about, you know, In Memoriam is not just about one column or a couple of columns in the weeks following someone's death in an obituary paper. It goes on and on, memory goes on. And Return is also about, you know, is about the memory going on as people, you know, as funerals finish, as bodies decompose into the earth if they've been buried, as ashes get scattered, and that physical presence in whatever form dissipates. So there's those two pieces. And there was also a third piece, which is called A Part of Me Goes With You. And that was also about the same theme. You know, there's the initial memorial where things are more structured. Then as time goes on, you know, memories change, they shift, bits start to dissipate, new bits arise. But that connection is always there. This piece I really want to share. This is a really important piece in my practice, but also I think in the grieving space. This was bought by a friend of mine who has had many cancers. She's 80 and has had another recent burst of radiotherapy for cancer. She has a granddaughter who she's very, very close to and will be very, very sad and very affected when her grandmother dies. So she has bought this piece to leave to her granddaughter when she eventually dies. And she had me write a piece to go with it, and that has now influenced another body of work. So if I just go previous quickly, back to one last piece of artwork here. This piece here is called Death, and it was made from gathering debris and leaves and other matter from the Kew Cemetery, so it's a site-specific work, and then eco-dyeing with that, and then stitching, and you can see that I've used some of the debris, the sticks and things in that as well. It's a bit hard to see here, but if you look closely, there's small tombstones and ghosts and picked out of the patterning and stitched in to talk about, you know, the quality of that particular site and the graveyard, which is a site of not just burial of the dead, but it's also a site of grieving and a really important sort of site to that local community. Now I'll just move forward again. Next. And in terms of artworks, a recent body of work that I've been exploring, which has got a practical purpose as well as stimulating conversations and maybe being effective on the wall, is this series of works here, which are little paper, felted paper, journey pockets and shroud veils. So this is the body of prototype work I've been exploring that can be journey pockets that can be laid with the person in a coffin or on top of a coffin, and people can slip in flowers, mementos, letters, photos to travel on that journey so it's to sort of engage people in the funerary rites, give them another focus for working with their grief, and maintaining their relationship connection through that burial or cremation process. It's also one of the things that really drew it to me, because it's very sustainable, environmentally friendly. It won't take you know, years and years for the paper to break down, and it won't leave toxins in the ground. So whether it's a burial or whether it's a cremation, it's got that sort of sustainability aspect about it too. And the idea of shroud veils, you know, not closing people over with heavy boxes, but laying something soft and light over the top of them, which marks the separation or the veil between the worlds, but also leaves an accessibility visually and sort of emotionally too, and supporting that process. So that's that body of work. I guess there'll be another iteration of that sometime in the near future. Yeah, and the final thing I really want to talk about is the recent book. And this garment features in the recent book. This garment was made for the Mourning the Missing project, and it was called Come Home and Be Wrapped in Safety and Love. And it was a garment to honour, missing children and their families. And it's made from children's books, which are all cut out in children's size handprints and footprints, stitched over children's clothes. And the photographer that photographed the When Words Are Not Enough, the big Victorian mourning garment, did for me at my request a beautiful set of photos in particular contexts for me for the book, and then I've written that book, and that's now self-published and available. And it's a study in grieving, or a reflection on grief. Meant to be held, meant to be read through, and to be a solace. That book has been a 10-year project for me. Ever since my grandson died, I wanted to write a book about the journey of grief and my reflections and the things that I've learned about grief along the way, both through my experience and through my practice of art. And I also wanted to be able to do something to honour my daughter and my grandson and give something back. So that book, which I'm going to finish up with, does that, because I'm putting a percentage of proceeds back into a fund that then will be redistributed to stillbirth projects, and my daughter will be having the running on the distribution of that, and that helps her with her grieving process too, and it really helps keep Cody in the world, you know, keep him doing something, making a contribution, and being really involved in everyone's lives. So I thought that I would come back on. So that's the cover of the book, but I'm going to come out of the shared screen, and I've got a copy of the book here. Can everyone see me again? So that's the book. Sorry, I'm going to have to stand up. Yeah, this is a little awkward. So it consists of, it's got a little dedication page on the front, so if people want to give it to someone, consists of just short statements along with some beautiful photographs. Lynn's got a copy ready to collect, about the grieving journey. And it's a bit of a difficult thing to do over I feel a bit play school, you know, doing the book reading through there. But there is a link, Lynn, there is a link to it. Is it on Grant Well's website, Lynn? I think there's a link to it. I'll find out and let Lynn know what it is anyway, that it can, there's a bit of a YouTube link that can be flipped through. But I wanted to finish by reading the little verse at the back, which was the verse I wrote for my friend Annie at her request, who now owns the piece of work called A Part of Me Goes With You. I'm just looking for glasses. And it was that sort of confluence of events that sort of made me think, oh yes, the book is now done. So a part of me goes with you. When someone we love dies, they are not lost to us. The absence of their physical presence does not mean they are gone from our lives. Our relationship with them continues, grounded in the love we share. The attention we pay to that relationship will see it grow and deepen over time. The voice of our loved one still speaks to us in the quiet moments, in the sigh of the wind, in the whisper of the trees, in the steady beating of our hearts, in soft words when we least expect it. Be still and you will hear them. The touch of our loved one is still felt in the warmth of the sun on our skin, in the treasured objects we have kept and gently hold, in those soft, tender and surprising textures that brush against us in passing. Be still and you will feel them. Their smiling eyes still look into our souls, in the gleam of moonlight, in the twinkle of a drop of water lit by the sun, in our sleeping body when we open to seeing what is always there, in unexpected glimpses at the edge of our vision. Be still and you will see them. When we reach out in love, here and there do not exist. Time does not separate. Memory and presence live in the same moment, now and in the future. When a loved one dies, they do not disappear from our lives. A part of you will go with them, and a part of them will always be with you. In the love you share, you are always together. And that was the final verse from that book. I think that's about all I've got to talk about in terms of my presentation. So thank you everybody for coming, and I'm going to hand back to Lynn and open the floor for questions.
Hi, Steph.
Lynn, I just always wanted to say, sort of promote Coffin Club too, that I've got a bit of a deal going through Kebiyonkya and the Coffin Club, is that for every book that is ordered with the promo code that Lynn can provide, then a percentage will also go into their fundraising efforts for tender funerals or wherever they would like that to go as well. So it's two different.
Yes. I posted a comment while you were talking, Anzara. I don't know whether people saw it, but I have given that as a gift to two people last year who lost their partners and really quite devastated by it. I gave them at different times, but for both of them it was around about 3 to 5 months after the event. And I actually think that giving it that period afterwards was actually really valuable, because it talked to the memory and the grief and the pain, and they actually became really quite emotional from it, actually, yeah. Apart from it being an extraordinarily beautiful book.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, Stephanie, because I think, you know, that number of months after a death and after a funeral, the shock starts to wear off, and you've done the clean outs, and then you have to work out how to live the rest of your life with that gap. And I think sometimes, you know, with projects or with things like the book, that they're really significant times to engage in reading or in art making, or those sorts of things. Yeah.
I'll just say thank you so much, Anzara. That was such a beautiful poem. I didn't know about your book, so I'll certainly be looking into that. It just strikes me as that this is so necessary, this kind of work that you're doing, and the work that you're doing with people who are bereaved. And I just wonder, and I, you know, to yourself and to others here, you know, is this an area where we really need, you know, funding, more money in this area of work, because there's so little opportunities for most people to involve themselves in this creative process. People can seem to do it organically if they're that way inclined, but for those who maybe have never been exposed to creative ways of, you know, working and processing emotions, I just wonder, is this something that, do you think there's space for it to go mainstream in terms of counselling work and grief work?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I didn't read from my paper, but one of the things we had to address at the end was the implications of the work that we were doing. And one of the things that I said two things need to happen. More funding does need to be put into this space, and as communities we need to ask for more funding from those funding bodies, so that those sorts of processes and opportunities can be ongoing, not just one-off or pilot projects or little special things that pop up now and again when, you know, it's politically favourable to put some money into it. The other thing is that the way we look at how grief per se is really important, because grief is an individual experience, but it's a social experience. And for some grief, having the psychologist and all that professional framework is important, but for most grief, it happens in the community and needs the support and the compassion and the understanding and the resources in the community, with professional knowledge brought in to support as needed, rather than it being a field where professionalism drives the field and the other thing just happens on the edges. Really, I think the community processes need to be in the middle with the professional support around the edges, which is what we did with the Mourning the Missing and the Wrap Me in Memories project. We had professional support available for people so that the artists didn't have to pick it all up. But, you know, it was rarely, if ever, called upon. People seemed to be satisfied knowing it was there and then engaging the process. So I would love to see more of this stuff become available on an ongoing basis, because lots of people also have that idea that, oh, I'm not an artist and my work is terrible, and, you know, all of that sort of thing that happens. But it's not about whether your work's terrible, good or otherwise. Sometimes people just need to be accompanied on the journey, you know, to show and there's a pathway and the options, and lose their self-consciousness about it so they can really engage and get the benefit.
Can I add a comment about the aged care sector, which I was exposed to for about 18 months. And I had raised your memory blanket with the provider that I was working with at the time.
Yeah.
And they were actually quite interested. It just wasn't the right time for them. But if you look at some of the more, you know, sort of adventurous providers that work with aged care people, there's actually a real interest in memory processes for people, like an extraordinary amount of interest. So I actually think that there's fertile ground anyway for the value of this. And I know from my own experience with my mother, because I quite actively couldn't stop myself engaging in art as a process with her, to actually, as she lost speech, and access was only possible through tactile means. It was extraordinarily valuable, but valuable for both of us. I've still got her artwork that she produced, that we worked on together, and that's now 8 years old.
Yeah, it's interesting, because in that Wrap Me in Memories project, it was designed for people with dementia and their families, but there were a few women in the residential aged care building who were either in very, very early dementia, or dementia wasn't really their big issue, or they didn't have family members to come in and support. And those women were watching what was happening and they were like, we want in on this. And they, in effect, formed their own little family, 3 of them, and said, no, we're coming to make quilts together. And they came in and made quilts, and they derived enormous benefit from the process. So it's, you know, it's a process that doesn't need to just apply to dementia, but in terms of that memory making, in that sharing of memories, in that reflective process, really, and that connecting process, really powerful. Yeah.
Can I talk about my experience? I mean, my that 3-piece garment, as a not the detail of it, but as about the process and what it does, and the sort of, like, because I can talk about the emotional context that goes on. So I did a 3-piece garment which represented the beginning, the middle and the end of an experience that I never want to repeat in my life. But in the processing of it, when I started, I actually I actually started with the beginning, and then when I was doing the beginning, I went, I don't want to start at the beginning. No, I think I started in the middle, and the middle was the awful part. And I went, I don't want to stay in the middle because that's really destructive. But how did I get to this middle? And I then produced a second piece, which was the beginning. And then I went, well, that's not what it's like, because actually that's not how I feel now. So then I actually had to produce a third piece, and the third piece was the process of having had to let go and start to see a brighter future for me. And for me, the value of the art was that the exploration and the insight and the narrative that was built into it was actually a really strong process of for understanding my emotions, understanding the experience, and also giving me hope and a sense that actually it is possible to work through this. And it was grief. And the reality is it was grief. It was grief and anger and heartache and everything else all tied up in a single bundle. And I really felt very strongly that that art piece was absolutely critical in my recovery.
And showing people the garment as opposed to bailing people up and telling them the story is a much better way of them getting it. You know, people don't generally like to be told or cornered, but to show them something that they can engage with from their own experience or their own viewing, it plants a seed, and it might not shift the perspective today, but if it's powerful, it will keep working on them and start to bring people into different perspectives.
You could see that on the faces of the audience at the time. I mean, I've often looked back at the photos that were taken by the photographer then, and you can see that it would have had an impact that I had never anticipated it would. I did it for myself. I didn't actually do it for them, but there's understood that this was a mechanism to carry a very powerful message to other people about the incredible damage that can be done with these sort of experiences.
But I think that's the power of narrative art, is that if you keep integrity with your own story and your own expression, then our experiences are, you know, every experience is unique, but they're also universal. The people will see things and there'll be resonances for them. Thank you very much for inviting me to be the first guest speaker on this series.